On this spooky episode of Projector, we journey into the ghost dimension for the finale of the Paranormal Activity series, while Vin Diesel is the last witch hunter. Hello and welcome to Projector, and first we're going to be turning out the lights for what is supposed to be the final installment of the Paranormal Activity series. When the Fleege family move into their new home, Father Ryan, played by Chris J. Murray, and his brother Mike, played by Dan Gill, find a specially modified VHS camera and a box of tapes that chart what happened to young Katie and Christy, played by Chloe Sangari and Jessica Taylor Brown in Paranormal Activity 3 and beyond. They come to realise this camera can see and record supernatural activity that can't be seen with the naked eye or traditional camcorders, and soon after their discovery, Ryan's daughter Leela, played by Ivy George, starts behaving strangely and interacting with the mysterious entity Toby that has plans for their child. So here we are again, another Paranormal Activity review in the dark. If you remember, last time I was doing this, I was reviewing Paranormal Activity 4, which is generally considered by fans of the series as being the worst in the entire franchise. And funnily enough, this film goes out of its way to not mention it in any shape or form. If you haven't seen the fourth or fifth films, don't worry. This movie's just going to pretend like they don't exist. The only link that I could find to the fourth film is the kid who plays Hunter very briefly reprises his role in a clip for about a second. That's it. When Paranormal Activity started out, you have to remember it was this micro-budget festival hit that the guy had shot in his own house with his own money, and it just built up into this huge blockbuster because of word-of-mouth screenings. They were just testing out all over the place and getting people to demand it. That was the big gimmick, demand it. And of course it made a whole bunch of money because it cost nothing to make, and it spawned this whole series. But not only did it do that, it basically became the figurehead for the entire found footage genre. And so we've had year after year after year of cheap horror movies, especially on the DVD market, of people going into haunted places and discovering, oh look, they're haunted! And that's the entire film, with no characters, just see what scares you can cook up in about 80-90 minutes. And Paranormal Activity itself felt this struggle because it had to incorporate a new gimmick every time. If you remember with the fourth film, it had the really stupid gimmick of the webcams and the Xbox Kinect. Do you remember that? The whole green dotted lights? Yeah, that's aged really well. That wasn't a stupid gimmick at all. As you probably know, this film's gimmick is that it's in 3D. It's the ghost dimension. See, 3D is a really stupid thing for a found footage movie to do because this is not being shot on 3D camcorders, you know, things that could actually do 3D. It is supposedly being shot on a VHS camcorder, like the third movie, but this camera in the movie has been modified to see ghosts, and what this means is that there's a lot of ghosts jumping out at you in 3D. The portions that are shot on camcorders, on traditional camcorders, are completely flat. They're all 2D, and that makes up about 20% of the running time. I actually thought when I saw this movie that I'd stepped into the wrong screening because the first 10 minutes of it are completely flat. And then, of course, the camera gets brought out and ooh, 3D action. Except the 3D isn't really noticeable very much unless they want to do a scare. Because all the scares in this movie are CGI. Every single one of them is CGI. And there's no suspense anymore because we've been through this routine so many times. And even the filmmakers seem to be aware that we're in inertia by this point. We know the beats of these movies and how it's going to take 2/3 of the way through to build up to a big spectacular climax. What the filmmakers here have tried to do is up the ante. So You remember how the other films in the series spent time developing tension? Screw that! We're just going to show the ghost throughout the entire movie. And you know what it looks like? It looks like a big CGI blob. That's what it is. And it's sort of neat at first, but it would have been more effective had they not revealed that 20 minutes into the movie. Because that is their only card, is black flying goop at the camera. That's all there is to offer in this movie, and variations of black flying goo jumps out of the camera, kind of creeps up behind someone. It's just all that. So those scenes that were genuinely memorable in the other Paranormal Activity movies, where something unseen would push something and gently prod it aside with a real playful quality to the scares, none of that is in evidence here. None of that. Because we see what the ghost is doing. We can see on the ceiling there is this huge wavy black lump that looks like the thing from The Grudge. The whole fear of the unknown, basically. Horror movies are scarier when you don't know what's attacking you. And the moment you start revealing backstory or start trying to humanize the monsters, you're in trouble. Paranormal Activity doesn't go that far, but by showing the monster, and by showing it so extensively, the whole format just stops working. You have this VHS camera that can see everything, and yet it takes several of the characters absolutely ages to deduce that the daughter might be possessed. The fact that she's going around biting people and being all reclusive might have been a hint, but apparently not, even though it's abundantly clear to the audience. And because it's so obvious, you just think, are these people stupid? Do they watch the tape? It's blatantly there. It's not even being subtle about it. Nothing in this movie is subtle anymore. They've stopped being subtle. And it has this thing where it's trying to tie together the mythology that's been built up, but none of it makes any sense anymore. And even this movie doesn't make any sense. Why were they recording these scenes up to 1992? Why were they doing that? Did the guy in Paranormal Activity 3 make this camera? And of course, my favourite question that I like to pose in all these found footage movies that apparently they never attempt to try and answer: who is editing this footage? Who? And they could have been clever about it. They could have been, because the guy, he has all these computer monitors and he's rifling through the footage. They could have been really clever and said that was the guy who was editing Paranormal Activity 3. Because he's watching Paranormal Activity 3. There are scenes where we're just watching him watching scenes from Paranormal Activity 3. But no, the movie doesn't even try to go down that avenue. The series has so lost its way by this point that not even Katie, the adult version of Katie Featherston, she doesn't show up in this movie. It's mentioned very briefly that she might have had a hand in what's going on, but she doesn't show up. Even she doesn't appear in these movies anymore. And by the ending, where the suspension of disbelief is just gone, just ridiculous. And yet we're still meant to believe this is edited, because we're still keeping that format from the first movie. The ending doesn't feel like a capper to an entire series. It feels like we're being set up for another one. It's like they just decided that this was going to be the ending because they didn't know what to do next. I mean, even the low-budget horror franchise thing has really moved on. Jason Blum is still a producer on this, but at least with Blumhouse, his production company, at least movies like Sinister and Insidious and The Gift, which were all low-budget movies, maybe not as much as Paranormal Activity shooting in someone's house, but still fairly low budget. At least he's turned out movies that have had a, feel like movies and have quality, whereas this feels tired, listless, and a last gasp of a subgenre. If Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension is the final movie in this series, and I have serious doubts about that, then that's only because they have done literally everything that can be possibly done with this concept. Everything about this movie is more silly than scary, full of constant CGI jumping out of the screen in 3D that's about as far away from the micro-budget origins of this franchise as you can get, while also trying to tie together the series' convoluted and far-fetched mythology that frankly doesn't satisfy, because the answers it supposedly provides only raises more questions. We go through the same motions yet again, only a bit crazier than usual, in what is basically the cinematic equivalent of a haunted house ride at a carnival. After the break, Vin Diesel slays witches, and can we please turn the light on now? Welcome back as Vin Diesel faces the forces of darkness in The Last Witch Hunter. Cursed with immortality after smiting the Witch Queen, played by Julie Engelbrecht, 14th century warrior Calder, played by Vin Diesel, has passed through the ages as a legend, upholding the fragile truce that exists between humans and witches as part of the secret sect, the Axe and Cross. When those wielding dark magic instigate a plot that could destroy humanity, Calder must work with witch and dreamwalker Chloe, played by Rose Leslie, to aid him remember a secret from his past that could help him save the world. It must be great being Vin Diesel, to be the star of one of the highest grossing franchises in the world and being able to do anything that you want. And if you're going to do a vanity project, then why not do it around your Dungeons and Dragons character? You almost have to admire it for its geekiness. And you know what else Last Witch Hunter has in its favour? It's an original property. It's not based on another IP, and it's not, ostensibly based on a book series that they're going to try and wheel out into a trilogy and maybe split the third one into two. But despite being original, it's very derivative. And I suppose that is what happens when you hand the keys to this particular kingdom to the people that wrote Priest and Dracula Untold, two of the worst examples of this particular genre. I mean, seriously! The fact the movie manages to rise up to mediocre should almost be an accomplishment considering the writers that they've attached to this. And I have to say, part of the problem is Diesel himself, because Diesel is meant to be playing the Highlander, essentially. He's this guy that's travelled through the ages, and he's meant to be, at his heart, a 14th century warrior who is haunted by the ghosts of his long-dead family, and yet Vin Diesel doesn't seem to really want to play that in his performance. Most of the time he just feels like yet another Vin Diesel character smirking along. In fact, there's even a point made about the fact that he's very adaptable to modern society. It just seems like he had a tragic backstory because that's what characters in these sort of movies are meant to have. He even drives around in a sports car for no other reason than that's what Vin Diesel characters do. Of course, it doesn't help that the world around him doesn't feel particularly sketched out either. The biggest issue with The Last Witch Hunter is that it's so messy and convoluted. And I know building a world from scratch is a very difficult thing, but The Last Witch Hunter doesn't even make it appealing, let alone make any sense. I never really got a feel for what the sort of hierarchy is, or how witches really interacted with humans. There's passing mentions, and it falls into this real trap that you get with magic in movies, in that it can literally just do anything. It's a magic cure-all. So you'll have characters that will suddenly just adopt powers, like Rose Leslie's character spends the first half of the film just by Vin Diesel's side trying to help him get a certain chemical, and then it turns out she's a dream walker that can walk into his dreams, making the last 20 minutes completely pointless. Like, that's not good writing, to have, your plot developments invalidate the previous plot developments, and yet Last Witch Hunter does that again and again and again and again and again throughout its entire running time. This is not twisty writing, this is just annoying and doesn't make the world seem like it has any logic to it whatsoever. And yet, all those betrayals and turns, I saw them coming from a mile away because we've seen them in so many films before. It doesn't have any identity. The sort of integration between witches and humans and that whole fantasy society thing, we've seen that in movies like Hellboy 2, and And Blade. This movie is like Blade if it was really lame and didn't have any kind of logic to it. It's especially so regarding the actual witch hunting. You might think, given the title, at least Vin Diesel has a lot of scenes where he's slaying witches and things like that. Not so. He barely slays anything in this movie. In fact, in his work as part of the Axe and Cross, he spends much of this film capturing witches and having to feed them to this giant CGI rock monster thing that is only in the movie so he can fight it at the end of it, for the most arbitrary of reasons. You could have used this to make a really violent, really scary movie, but the end result is a not quite a horror movie, not quite an action movie, just sort of a limp flop on screen. And it just goes on for 90 minutes contradicting itself. And the whole thing is clearly set up to be a franchise because there's characters and plot threads that kind of go nowhere and they're just winking towards a sequel. But there's no reason to invest in any of the characters or this world. You look at the supporting cast, and even the supporting players are completely under-characterised. You've got actors like Elijah Wood and Michael Caine who just disappear for stretches of the movie in barely defined roles. Caine in particular looks like he's completely lost. The only reason that Caine is in this movie is to give it some shred of integrity. He's basically like Judi Dench in the Chronicles of Riddick, and similarly underused. And so what ends up happening is that you watch this movie and the only thing that's registering over you is the barrage of special effects that are just happening at every single moment. And fair play to the special effects, they look pretty, they look nice, but there's no story. It's just Vin Diesel goes to somewhere, special effects happen, Vin Diesel goes to another place, and then more special effects happen. And even the villains of the film feel like afterthoughts. They don't feel like tangible threats to Vin Diesel's character because he is immortal and can do anything. He knows everything. He's a walking exposition dump. Oh, I see 3 flies on the floor, that means that evil's coming. Okay, I guess that's something you pick up. See, in a good movie, those details would pay off so that we could understand what's going on, whereas The Last Witch Hunter just casually discards them and calls it world building. And everything about the movie is deeply forgettable. Even the villains feel generic and feel like they're just stock, and the battles between them and Diesel are borderline incomprehensible. There's just loads of scenes where Diesel can just hack at them and suddenly it will be shattering like glass, or there'll be witchy vines that just go into this big morass of stuff, or Vin Diesel will end up in a dream and he'll get lost in his dream, and some things that are happening in the dream are corresponding with real life, and if you die in the dream, and none of it makes sense, and after a certain point you just tune out of it. And that's the thing, this is meant to be fun, it's meant to be enjoyable, but the whole thing is so turgid and so self-serious. Apart from the really awkward moments where they shoehorn in comic relief, Elijah Wood has the absolute worst of this, having to really bring in all the laugh lines like, "I want a raise, ha ha ha." Very funny, very cute. At least Wood seems to be aware of what kind of movie he's in and really seems to be hamming it up. I did enjoy Wood in this film, but he is so much better than this. And I wanted to come out of this movie saying, yeah, that was awesome. Unfortunately, what he come out of it thinking is, boy, Vin Diesel likes writing fanfic about himself. The Last Witch Hunter is simply a load of special effects in search of a story. Despite being a rare original fantasy film, its attempts to build its own mythology are frankly muddled at best, where anything can happen simply because it can and the rules constantly changing. And what there is highly derivative of other better movies in the genre, including Blade and Highlander. It mostly exists to allow Vin Diesel to look cool as he poses with a flaming sword, barely attempting to feel like a character with a weight of centuries on his shoulders, and try and start a new franchise while it's at it, while wasting what little of interest there is in this otherwise dreary generic actioner. There's more sinister films to come on Projector, but until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
I wanna see